Hello my dear friends, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. What if Naruto was chosen to restore the Uzumaki clan with Konoha's finest, Ino, Hinata, Sakura and Kurenai? Part 1. Let's start the fanfic. My ramen, Naruto mumbled irritably. Mine. Gue. He knew that the Holy Ramen Festival was a dream, but he was in that magical state between sleep and wakefulness that he could slip right back. If whatever it was that kept getting shoved into his side would just go away, he could return to being the Holy Emperor of Ramania. Naruto grabbed the offending item, not caring enough try and figure out what it was. He just wanted to keep it from poking him, and holding it still seemed like a great idea. Instead of obligingly letting him go back to sleep, the darn thing abruptly pulled away from him, his grip on it pulling him with it before he could let go. Half asleep and trapped in a blanket, he fell to the floor with a muffled thud. Sushi. He cursed randomly, his mind still somewhat trapped in dreamland. He struggled to extricate himself from the blanket. You dare challenge the Holy Ramen? Finally clear of his entanglements, he jumped to his feet to face Ino. What are you doing in my apartment, Ino? Naruto asked, utterly confused by her presence. Your apartment? We're in my living room, you nitwit. Who are you calling nitwit, Blondie? Naruto snapped back automatically before taking stock of his surroundings. Oh, I guess we aren't in my apartment. No, we're not in your apartment. Wit, she said, her eyebrow twitching dangerously. What are you doing in my house? I was sleeping, until someone rudely woke me, Naruto said, motioning to the couch he'd been pulled off of. It had actually been more comfortable than his lumpy mattress. He and Inoichi-san had been trying to ease past his mental defenses into his mindscape the night before, and the progress they had made was very tiring. Apparently Jinchuriki naturally developed formidable mental barriers. The older blonde had offered to let him sleep on the couch and Naruto had been far too tired to refuse. He'd simply flopped down and was out like a light. Inoichi had apparently slipped a pillow under his head and thrown a blanket over him, which was certainly nice of him. Naruto sniggered as Ino's appearance fully registered in his mind. Ino was vain. It was no secret that she took great pride in how she looked, and Naruto had hardly seen her with so much as a hair out of place or a wrinkle in her always fashionable clothes. Naruto could admit objectively that she was the best-looking girl in his class, but the fact that Sakura-chan wasn't afraid to get messy when she got angry was large part of her charm, in Naruto's opinion. The fact that he was the only one who made Sakura-chan lose her composure meant something good, obviously. Seeing Ino as she was now was a rather surreal experience for him. It was like she was a completely different person. Her hair was messy and in tangles, her eyes bleary from just waking up, and her rumpled pajamas looked like they belonged to a little girl with all the cartoony kittens on it. She was holding a long-handled garden hoe in a defensive stance, which was what she'd used to prod him awake. What's so funny? She bit out crossly, her eyes narrowed. Kittens, Ino. She paled as she realized what she must look like, and then flushed in embarrassment and anger. Naruto. She growled out, swinging the gardening implement at his head. Naruto leaned back just far enough for the metal to less than an inch from his nose. There was a moment of incomprehension on Ino's part before she realized that yes, Naruto really had dodged. She resumed trying to maim him. Sakura isn't the only girl who's cute when she's mad, Naruto mused as he easily danced around her strikes. How odd. Naruto was having fun, and expressed with it with a beaming grin. It took only a few dodges before he was throwing in excess acrobatics to spice things up. In the 2 weeks since he'd started training with Guy and Lee, he hadn't fought against anyone even close to being on his level. Lee was still completely out of his league, not to mention how utterly outclassed he was by Guy and Kakashi. He'd known he was getting better, but he hadn't had a chance to really get a sense of how much until now. There hadn't been any sparring amongst Team 7 since they'd officially passed, just boring D-rank mission after boring D-rank mission. He'd sparred with Ino in the academy, and he could reluctantly admit she'd been more skilled than him. His superior stamina and stronger build had allowed him to beat her, at least after a certain age. After meeting Inoichi-san, it made sense to Naruto that Ino had been skilled enough to take him down before he developed his horrendous, brawler style. The Yamanaka clan head was a seriously cool guy, and a Junin to boot. He would have made sure that Ino wasn't slacking off in her training. Come to think of it, the only students that he knew for sure hadn't been beaten by Ino at some point were Sasuke and Kiba. Out of the girls in his class, Naruto would have to say that she'd been the best in taijutsu from what he'd seen. But Sakura-chan is smarter. Naruto thought, assuaging his guilt at comparing her negatively to her rival, even though it was just in his head. After just 2 weeks of training with Guy and Lee, it was amazing to spar with Ino again. The gap between them was ridiculous. She simply wasn't fast enough to give him any trouble, and she was telegraphing her every move. Maybe she'd be better if she wasn't swinging a gardening tool around. But even if she was still more skilled than him, which he very much doubted, it simply wouldn't be enough to even challenge his new speed. Stand still. Damn it. Ino snarled as she tried to hit him. In the middle of cartwheeling over a horizontal swing, Naruto absently reached out and stopped a vase from falling over. The graceful and unthinking ease of that action was another awesome benefit of the Kage Bunshin. Naruto was intensely familiar with his body. There was a huge difference between training physically for 100 hours total and having 100 clones each train for an hour, aside from the fact that took 100th of the time. The more he trained with his real body, the more his body changed. This was a very good and very intended consequence, of course. He was getting faster, stronger, more flexible, and a host of other things. But Naruto had the unique ability to train with his body for hundreds of hours without it changing on him. Guy-sensei had very excitedly explained why this was such an amazing advantage. His proprioception, muscle control, and really anything to with physical awareness or control could be trained to an incredible extent that simply wouldn't be possible without Kage Bunshin. He'd never been ridiculously clumsy before, but gracefulness hadn't been a trait he could have claimed either. Now it definitely was. Guy-sensei had spent a good deal of time making sure that Naruto could recognize what kinds of things needed to be trained with his real body for the conditioning and what could be mostly left to the clones. The increased awareness and control over his body actually made it incredibly easier to learn things of a physical nature. There was training hard and there was training smart. It was easy to overlook because of how excessively Guy-sensei took the idea of train hard, but the eccentric Junin definitely knew what it meant to train smart. After Naruto had been made aware that the kind of tutelage he was receiving was generally paid for, he'd quite reluctantly broached the subject with his teacher. Reluctantly because he certainly didn't have the finances to pay even a fraction of what he valued his training with Guy and Lee at. Guy had firmly rejected the idea of getting paid for his time. Well, he'd actually said something about how the springtime of youth was a beautiful and priceless thing that was a reward unto itself, but Naruto had gotten the picture. He'd already known that Guy was probably the nicest person he'd ever met, but now Naruto was positive that it simply wasn't possible to be any nicer than Maida Guy. That's how awesome he was. Speaking, or at least thinking, of being nice, Naruto thought that letting Ino keep at trying to murder him with a garden hoe was going to end in something getting smashed. That would be a poor way to thank Inoichi-san for trying to help with the Kyuubi issue. Okay. Naruto acknowledged Ino's demand for him to stand still, doing so abruptly. Wait, what? Ino froze mid-swing as the other blonde inexplicably obeyed her. What's wrong with you? You're not supposed to actually stand still when someone's trying to hit you. Then why did you tell me to? Naruto teased. Make up your mind, will ya? Nitwit. Ino growled in frustration, taking another swing at him. Naruto could tell that this wasn't a genuine attempt to hit him. Her body language showed no intent to follow through, so he didn't move a muscle. Sure enough, she pulled back enough to miss him when he continued standing still. Ino glared at him. I'm going to hit you for real this time, she warned. Okay, Naruto said cheerfully. She did swing at him for real, so he jumped back to avoid it, and then dashed forward the instant it was past him. It was but a moment's work to push her backwards down to the floor and disarm her in single smooth motion, ending up kneeling beside her. He gently but firmly pressed on the back of her load-bearing knee, forcing the leg to collapse and letting her roll with the motion instead of slamming her back into the ground. She looked up at him in shock, before pouting. You said you were going to stay still. Naruto smirked. I lied. It's a ninja thing. Daddy, Naruto's trying to ravish me, Ino accused, so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the words to really click in his mind. Naruto scurried backwards, panicking. What? I mean, no. I'm not. I would never. He tripped over himself trying to protest the unfair accusation. Inoichi and a blonde woman, who Naruto had never met before but assumed was Ino's mother, were watching them from the doorway to the kitchen. Ino sat up, tucking her knees under her chin and her eyes were filled with hurt and her lip was quivering. Never. You think I'm ugly, don't you? She looked like she was about to cry. No. No. Naruto backtracked. You're pretty, incredibly pretty. He would have kept going, except that Ino was suddenly looking very self-satisfied and not the least bit weepy. You are after my body, she declared smugly. I suppose I can't blame you for falling in love with me. You never stood a chance. Naruto flushed in embarrassment, glaring at the girl. No way. You've got cooties. Naruto declared imperiously, wishing he could take it back as soon as it came out of his mouth. Ino had flustered him to the point of being unable to use anything more sophisticated than a 6-year-old's taunts. Oddly enough, it turned out to be very effective. What? Ino shrieked, her smugness evaporating. Take that back. Naya. Naruto replied childishly, making another dig at her pajamas. Not gu Naya. Take it back. Ino leapt to her feet, charging at him in fury. Ino's parents watched as their daughter tried her best to pound the boy's face in. Naruto was effortlessly dancing around her, sing-songing, Naya. Noises as he did so, which seemed to infuriate Ino even more. They're 13, not 8, right? Inoichi asked his wife bemusedly. You're the one who said she was in too much of a hurry to grow up. I may have been too hasty in that assessment, he admitted. Surprise attack of youth. Lee snapped his leg down from above his head at a speed that Naruto wouldn't have been able to even see a week before. He barely managed to get his arm braced in the proper position to deflect the kick. Despite that, Naruto was knocked to the side rather than Lee's leg being deflected. Lee was on him in an instant, striking out with punches before Naruto had a chance to regain his bearings. Surprise. 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 Yosh. Oof. Naruto wheezed out as he was nailed in the stomach. He'd managed to deflect and dodge several strikes by the skin of his teeth before Lee slipped past his defenses. Not that he was under the misconception that Lee was actually going anywhere near all out. Lee was limiting himself to a speed that was just enough to run Naruto ragged and then a touch over, but nothing beyond that. It was training to get Naruto used to combat that was a pace above his own abilities, which was essential for defending against superior opponents. That was very good, Naruto-kun. Lee gushed, having stopped after landing a solid hit. Your improvement has been incredibly youthful. Thanks, Naruto said, trying to get his breath back. The 20 kilograms of weight he had on each limb had added to the difficulty of the exercise, but he wasn't complaining. Lee was wearing much more. But you know, attacking from the front and yelling surprise before you attack is not actually a surprise attack, right? If you're going to yell it out, you should do it after. But it is triply surprising and youthful this way. Huh. Naruto was nonplussed. If no one is expecting a surprise attack from behind without warning, then giving a warning makes it doubly surprising. And doing it head-on makes it triply surprising, and youthful. Lee was practically bouncing on his feet with excitement as he explained. He gave an enthusiastic thumbs up at his favorite word. A surprise that isn't a surprise isn't more surprising than a surprise that's just a surprise. Wait. Naruto's brow furrowed as he thought over what he'd just said. Okay, yeah, that sounded about right. Then surprise with, a surprise, Lee scribbled into his notebook, face scrunched in concentration as he mistranscribed what he'd heard. No, that's not, never mind. Naruto sighed in resignation, resisting the urge to rub his temples. Sometimes it was in the best interests of his sanity to just ignore Lee's eccentricities. Lee's teammate Tenten giggled from where she was sitting on a tree branch watching, swinging around a wicked-looking kusarigama. It had 3 blades which snapped into position much like a Fuma shuriken. The girl had a seemingly never-ending arsenal of incredibly awesome sharp and pointy things. The graceful way she was twirling it around in complicated patterns was nothing short of art. If Naruto were to try anything even a tenth as complicated as what she was doing so casually, he'd probably end up chopping off his in about 3 seconds flat, not that it stopped him wanting to try. That was what Kage Bunshin were for, after all. Naruto had met Lee's teammates a few times in passing the last couple of weeks. With Guy-sensei as their instructor, it was no surprise that they seemed deadly competent. Tenten was surprisingly normal, but Neji was a pretty much Sasuke with girlier hair. Apparently the Rookie of the Year title came with a complimentary 15-foot pole to shove where the sun don't shine. And that was to replace the 10-foot one that they came equipped with. Tenten was nice though, not on the level of Guy and Lee, but she did offer to help him train instead of sneering at him like he was trash. Well, she offered to give him practice dodging projectiles in return for giving her a moving target that she didn't have to hold back on for fear of maiming. She took a bit too much pleasure in brutally killing clone after clone. If she showed up before Guy's team was supposed to meet, he'd give her some clones to slice, stab, and otherwise sadistically lacerate to death. Oddly enough, she'd started showing up about 45 minutes early every day he trained with Guy and Lee when he'd started doing that. It was probably a complete coincidence. Those circle things were interesting, Naruto noted. She'd been using a new kind of weapon today. I had a weird time trying to deal with them. They're called chakram, Tenten informed him. They looked like fun, so I thought I'd try them out. You thought you'd try them out, just like that? Naruto shook his head in amazement. I'd hate to be on the other end of those after you've had some time to train with them. And whoever you buy all your weapons from must love you, getting that much stuff on a whim. Tenten smirked at the praise. Oh, he better. He's my father. She looked at him slyly. Come to think of it, I've never seen you use kunai or shuriken. You should drop by sometime and get yourself properly outfitted. The steel dragon only has the highest quality gear, she shamelessly self-advertised. Quality meant expensive, so Naruto was about to decline in some hopefully uninsulting way when he had a sudden thought. Do you carry explosive tags? The best, she promised with a knowing smile. You boys and your explosions. And you don't like them. I find that hard to believe. Oh, I didn't say that. Tenten's tone was amused, and Naruto felt a shiver run down his spine as he imagined what she could do with explosive tags. I'll drop by sometime then. Naruto's interest wasn't in buying, but selling. Sure, it would be nice to buy some nice stuff for once, but that would cost money that he didn't have. He'd shifted a good deal of his training time into fuinjutsu after deciding that it was going to be a much-needed source of income. The Sandaime had been absolutely correct about Inoichi-san being willing to do the initial consultation for free. The old man had also been right about how involved his project would be. Inoichi had confirmed that it wouldn't be simple. Fuinjutsu was really suited to training with clones. There was so much to learn, practice, and experiment with that there was no struggle to avoid clones overlapping in what they were learning. And he could be far less careful with seals given that any mishaps would only end up dispelling a clone. Efficiency was something he was trying to be more aware of. At first, he'd been perfectly happy having pretty much all of his clones working on the same thing. So what if there was some useless overlap? He could make slots of clones after all. But the instant gratification of advancing in one or two things really quickly was an atrocious waste of his training method's full potential. There were still some things he felt were worth flooding with clones though. Chakra control was important enough to warrant lots of extra clones doing exactly the same thing, for instance. It benefited pretty much everything else he did, so the wasted effort wouldn't actually be wasted. Yosh! Lee exploded, interrupting Naruto's thoughts. I too shall help Naruto-kun be properly equipped. I shall get you a proper jumpsuit, like mine. No, I shall get you an orange one. Oh no, no way in hell, Naruto thought, panicking a little. It was true that his clothes had been taking a lot of abuse in the past few weeks and he could do with something more durable, but that was not an option. Lee was looking so proud at the idea of tainting the purity of orange. It was hard to resist the urge to scream, hell no, but with Lee that would feel like kicking a puppy. He was just so nice and genuine, and he didn't realize the monstrous evil of his offer. Explaining what Naruto thought of his jumpsuit would be plain insulting. Definitely not something Lee would deserve. Naruto decided to try and sidestep the issue. Did you say something? Pretending he didn't hear seemed like a viable option. Gay. Naruto-kun is so hip. Lee had an expression of ridiculous shock on his face, far out of proportion to what Naruto had said. What the hell kind of reaction is that? Naruto wondered. A single thought. Kakashi showed up, pulsed from the cage Bunshin posing as him, giving him an excuse to get away from Lee before the boy could try to turn the jumpsuit issue into some kind of competition. Hiding somewhat in the shadows, Naruto watched as his team plus a clone exited the Hokage Tower. He was trying not to flaunt his use of the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Sasuke had gotten really weird about it when he'd shown it as an explanation for his rapid improvement. Sasuke seemed fine with it at first, but he'd immediately asked Naruto to teach it to him. Although it had been phrased as a request, his tone made it clear that it was more along the lines of a demand. Aside from Naruto's feeling of possessiveness over the technique, the old man had explicitly forbidden him teaching it to anyone else. None of his classmates would even be able to muster enough chakra to make even one clone, and if they tried forcing the issue too much they could even end up hurting themselves. Not to mention it was a forbidden technique. Unwilling to get into why he was allowed to use it and not Sasuke, Naruto had deflected by telling the other boy that he couldn't just ask for techniques like he was entitled to them. That seemed to settle the issue, but the next day Sasuke showed up and very begrudgingly offered to let Naruto borrow a scroll on Kaden Gokyaku no Jutsu so he could try to learn it in exchange for the clone technique. Naruto had been beyond insulted. Gokyaku was a C-rank technique that he had already learned from Fundamentals of Ninjutsu, and he'd seen instructions for it in at least 3 other books he'd gone over in the library. And if that wasn't bad enough, Sasuke had implied that he didn't even think Naruto could learn the technique. The blonde had told the Uchiha where he could shove his offer. The bastard even had the nerve to look affronted, as if he thought he'd proposed a fair deal. He'd let the issue go after that, but Naruto had a very bad feeling about the predatory look in his eyes every time he saw Naruto use clones from then on. Information on the Sharingan was something he'd come across a few times in his research, so Naruto had a fair idea what his teammate was thinking. If Sasuke already had the vaunted eyes of his clan, it was doubtful he would have even bothered offering anything for Kage Bunshin in the first place. Theoretically, Naruto wouldn't mind if Sasuke copied a few of his jutsu. Not Kage Bunshin obviously, and certainly not the things he was coming to regard as his personal jutsu, like Konoha no Jutsu. But if Sasuke was going to be a total about it, he wasn't getting anything from Naruto. He resolved not to use anything that he couldn't do without seals, or at least being able to reduce the number of seals, in front of the Uchiha, and he'd taken to periodically checking for genjutsu just in case the bastard got the smart idea to hide his stupid Sharingan. Once he'd thought of it, he realized it was probably a good idea even without the threat of a hidden Sharingan. It's not paranoia if your teammate has evil jutsu stealing monkey eyes, after all. Naruto formed a cross-like seal similar to the modified clone seal he used for Kage Bunshin, and put a small amount of chakra into it. The clone posing as him stood still as it got his mental message, pretending to look at something off to the side. The Sandaime had come through on his promise of letting Naruto take a closer look at the information on Kage Bunshin, and had even thrown in some other things related to it that certainly hadn't been in the scroll. One of those things had been a technique to communicate with his clones, and they to him and each other, that didn't involve making a clone and dispelling it. It allowed for a short thought to be broadcast across the mental network that connected clones to him, and that thought was even easy for those not intended as recipients to ignore. In this case, his message was, prepare to switch, and it was aimed at the clone posing as him with his team. Carefully using the full extended seals for the Kawarimi no Jutsu, Naruto seamlessly switched himself with his clone. There was no smoke and only the barest pulse of chakra as he stealthily performed the technique. It was something he'd practiced to the point where it should have been near impossible to detect, but nonetheless Kakashi turned and raised his visible eyebrow as though to say, "Do you really think you got away with that?" Naruto just shrugged, a bit put out that he hadn't gotten away with it. The first time he figured out that Kakashi had caught onto his game of not wasting his time waiting, Naruto thought he was in for a dressing down. The silver-haired Junin had done nothing, prompting Naruto to think that maybe he hadn't actually noticed, but the man always seemed to give him a look when he showed up for real. Naruto thought that the whole lateness thing might actually be a lesson of some sort, like when Kakashi had told them not to eat before the test. In the meantime though, it had become a game to try and switch without Kakashi noticing. So far the score was Kakashi 8, Naruto 0. Naruto frowned as the memories of the clone that had been posing as him flowed into his head. They'd been assigned the Ketch Tora mission, again, but that wasn't what was bothering him. Sakura was the cause of his consternation in this case. Hey Naruto, Sakura greeted him as he arrived at the training ground. Morning Sakura-chan. The clone was pleasantly surprised at her speaking to him first. Sakura never acknowledged him before he spoke, and her responses had always been half-hearted. Not that he was holding it against her, as their team meetings were early in morning. He was used to waking up even earlier to train with Guy and Lee, so he was wide awake by the time his clones showed up. In fact, the real Naruto had been training with Lee for the past hour since escaping the Yamanaka house, and was still having the crap beat out of him. Sakura was looking at him worriedly, seeming quite vulnerable. You still like me, right? The scenario was so similar to what had happened with Ino earlier in the morning that the clone almost had to pinch himself. It was just a funny coincidence, he was sure. Sakura wasn't the type of girl who would tease like her rival. Of course I do, Naruto reassured her. He was totally bewildered by the question. How could she even doubt it? And why did she suddenly care? Cha! Sakura shouted triumphantly, startling the blonde. Of course you wouldn't choose Ino Buddha over me. The conversation seemed to be over as far as she was concerned. Naruto stood stunned. What had just happened? Thankfully the clone had thought and brooded over the incident while waiting for Kakashi, so it didn't hit Naruto like it could have. Nonetheless, it was still incredibly hurtful. Sakura had rebuffed and even demeaned his advances for years. Most people thought that Naruto was simply too dense to realize what was happening, but that wasn't the case. The idea that he'd have to prove that he was worth her time didn't bother him. Compared to the systematic and village-wide effort to pretty much ignore his existence, Sakura's blatant rejections were practically validation in of themselves. But that was before this. The fact that Ino had thought to use his presence in her house as ammunition against Sakura wasn't surprising. The fact that she'd done so that incredibly quickly was surprising. Girls are weird, Naruto thought to himself. He could deal with the fact that Sakura didn't value his affections. That was something he'd simply been planning to change. But for her assert ownership of them when she thought they might be shifting to Ino while still making it clear she didn't have a use for them made him feel violated. Sakura was allowed to not accept his feelings. She was not allowed to reject them and then summarily toy with them for her petty rivalries. Naruto may be a bit annoyed with Ino for her part in this mess, but he was downright angry at Sakura. It was a weird feeling. Are you going to help us out like last time, Naruto? Kakashi asked as they reached the area that Tora had reportedly escaped from. How about another bet, Sasuke? Naruto asked, smiling mischievously. No, Sasuke replied curtly. He glared at the blonde as he remembered what had happened the last time they'd tracked down the cat. This was the fourth time they'd had the mission, catch Tora, and it had barely been more than a week since they'd started running missions. The second time they'd gotten it, mere days from the first, Naruto had decided to plan ahead and imbue the identifying ribbon tied to the cat's ear with a lot of his chakra. And sure enough, they'd been assigned the mission again a few days after that. There had still been enough chakra in the ribbon for him to sense it and track it down once they were within a couple 100 meters of the feline. Naruto had bet Sasuke that he could track down the cat in less than 10 minutes, with the terms being whoever lost the bet had to physically catch the cat. It had taken them hours to track down the damn thing the first 2 times, and Tora was a biter and scratcher. Sasuke had taken what he thought was a sucker bet, and Naruto had proceeded to go straight for the cat, pretending he was using his sense of smell. Sasuke had not been happy, and had tried to renege on the bet by claiming that Naruto cheated. Naruto had just shrugged and said he should have known that Sasuke wouldn't keep his word, and that had stung the other boy's pride enough to actually go through with it. Naruto had been treated to 10 very enjoyable minutes of watching Sasuke try to catch the cat. Sakura had tried to help, but Sasuke had curtly told her off, his pride still smarting from Naruto's insinuations. Pleased by how well his tracking method had worked, Naruto had placed a simple seal on the ribbon before they returned the cat. It was just meant to store and radiate his chakra, making the chakra last longer. Without the seal, he'd estimated that the chakra would have faded too much to be useful in a total of 5 or 6 days. With the seal, he was hoping something more like 2 weeks, and a larger effective area. It wasn't really necessary for Tora, but the mission was a nice testing ground for his little idea. Naruto discreetly pulsed his chakra to check for genjutsu, and Sasuke's eyes still lacked the Sharingan, so he created 3-Kage Bunshin. "What are you doing?" Sakura asked, wondering why he wasn't sniffing out the cat like last time. Two of the clones faced each other, crouched down, and the third clone stepped on their outstretched palms. The third clone jumped straight up as the other two abruptly stood and threw him towards the sky. All three were using chakra to enhance the movement, so the jumping clone shot up easily higher than 50 meters into the sky. Coordinating with clones was awesomely easy. "You expect me to reveal the ancient secrets of the Neko Nin Naya?" Naruto said, pointing to his whisker marks. The clones dispelled, giving him a fairly exact position for the cat. "Tora's about 150 meters that-a-way, by the river." Naruto pointed in the direction, and starting running that way. His team followed him. "Ancient secrets of the Neko Nin?" Sasuke asked, looking at him seriously. Naruto was surprised at just how genuine the question seemed. Sasuke appeared to be taking his joke way too seriously. What was up with that? "Emphasis on secrets, Naya," Naruto said playfully as he jumped through the trees. "That's not even close to funny," Sakura informed him. Naruto nearly growled at her. He wasn't in the mood to simply brush off her condescension. Not after the way she'd treated him in the morning. "It's your turn to catch the cat," Sasuke told Naruto. "There aren't turns, Tem. I did it last time," he insisted. "Because you lost a bet, fair and square." "That wasn't fair. You knew you would win." Naruto looked at him disbelievingly. "Of course I did. Why would I if I thought I could lose?" "That was cheating," Sasuke grumbled. "Was not. Was too. Was not. Was. I'm not doing this. That means I win, Naya. Just because I refuse to play your childish games does not mean you win." He wasn't going to let Naruto have the last word though. "Does too. Does not. Does T. Shut up," Sakura screamed, startling both boys. "I've had enough of both of you. Sasuke-kun, stop encouraging him. Naruto, stop with the stupid cat stuff already." Just the day before, the fact that she was including Sasuke in her reprimand would have sent Naruto over the moon. Today, it was just surprising. Okay, really surprising, but it didn't actually make him happy. In fact, arguing with Sasuke was pretty fun when the Tem didn't just go, HN, to everything, so he was actually annoyed by her interrupting them. "Not gun, Naya," Naruto told her stubbornly. Sakura flinched as though she'd been struck, and even Sasuke and Kakashi were looking at him in dumbstruck shock. Naruto had never talked back to Sakura. And Sakura's standard reaction to things she didn't understand: get very angry at them. "Naruto," she growled as she jumped at him, a manic expression on her face. "Naya Nian Nian, Nian Nian Naya." Naruto sang out childishly as he dodged around her attempts to catch him. He took off to the side through the forest, Sakura chasing after him while shouting threats and obscenities. "Che!" Sasuke scoffed, smirking. My win, Dobi. Oh really? Kakashi said, going back to his book. The way I see it, there's only one little genin left, and we still have a cat to catch. Sasuke paled. He tried to go after Naruto and Sakura. Naruto. Kakashi simply reached out and grabbed the back of his shirt without looking away from his Ika, cutting off Sasuke's angry shout and his escape. No you don't, the Junin admonished, hoisting the boy up by his shirt as he ineffectually tried to struggle out of Kakashi's grip. Tenten's claims had not been empty boasts. The quality of everything in the Steel Dragon was much better than Naruto was used to dealing with. He actually had a set of very nice kunai that the Sandaime had given him for his last birthday that he was now realizing had been bought here. They were so nice that Naruto hadn't want to so much as smudge them, and remained unused in a box in his apartment. Although the prices seemed pretty reasonable given the quality, this definitely wasn't a place he could afford to shop at given his finances. That didn't stop him from looking, however. In addition to the usual fare kunai, shuriken, wire, caltrops and the like, there was a great deal of much more exotic merchandise. Collapsible blades, barbed whips, and nodashi that were longer than Naruto was tall were just a few of the many things he never would have expected to see in a shinobi weapons shop. Despite the countless weirder and more interesting looking things, Naruto was drawn to odd contraption that looked like a giant crossbow with too many cables threaded through odd wheel-like devices on either side. It wasn't the kind of thing that looked to be useful in a shinobi battle, but that wasn't why he was interested in it. That could definitely work, Naruto thought, a devious smile appearing on his face as he looked at the size of the projectiles the thing was apparently meant to fire. Planning to lay siege, Naruto spun around in surprise. A few feet behind him is a tall man with short brown hair, about Kakashi's height but much broader. He seemed a whole lot more imposing than his Junin sensei. What? The man motioned to what Naruto had been entranced with. The compound ballista is a siege weapon. It's not really used by ninja anymore, but it's still popular for larger non-shinobi forces, such as mercenaries or private armies. It's more of a showpiece, although it is perfectly functional. Ah, I'm not planning a siege, Naruto said, gaining his bearings. I've just never seen anything like it before. I had to make sure, the man said, chuckling a bit. You had a smile on your face that reminded me a bit of my daughter when she sees a new weapon for the first time, which is always followed by vast amounts of damage done to training dummies. You're Tenten-san's father, Naruto realized. She said I should drop by if I needed any equipment. Oh ho, you know my daughter, the man said, smiling at him strangely. I'm Higurashi Kowski, owner and primary supplier of the Steel Dragon. Is there anything I can help you with? I hope so. I'm Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto introduced himself, watching the older man carefully for any signs of a negative reaction. He'd been much more reclusive in the past couple of weeks since learning of the Kyuubi, and besides Gai-sensei and Kakashi-sensei, this was really the first person he really got to scrutinize, knowing what his name and face must mean to them. Nice to meet you, Uzumaki-kun. So what is it that I can do for you? Kowski's smile didn't falter and there wasn't even the slightest indication that the man had a problem with Naruto or even recognized him. Was I getting all worked up for nothing? Naruto wondered. I heard that you sell explosive tags. We do, but not the low-power kind you trained with in the academy, Kowski said, his smile fading in favor of a much more serious expression. Weapons-level explosive tags are a completely different matter, and not the sort of thing I can see a genin needing. Plus they're quite expensive. If you just want something flashy, I'll have to direct you to a ton of metal. They carry the lower level tags. Here's a bit of advice though. Never buy lower than C grade for explosive seals, and anything level 5 and above, always spring for at least B grade. Yes, they're more expensive, but it's definitely worth it to avoid the risk of blowing yourself up. And don't take this the wrong way, kid, but I'm guessing that if you're using explosions in your missions at this point in your career, you're doing them wrong. Okay. Thanks for the advice, but I was actually looking to try and sell them to you, not buy them, Naruto said, scratching the back of his head self-consciously. Kowski chuckled a bit at the misunderstanding. Well, can't you just sell them back to wherever you got them from? Like I said, there's a certain quality assurance to my wares, and I can't be sure of the level of the work if I don't know the supplier. I didn't buy them, I made them, Naruto stated, a little defiantly. Kowski's brow furrowed disbelievingly. You can make explosive tags? Naruto bristled at being underestimated. Yes, he knew that sealing was a difficult line of study and that it was entirely reasonable to think he was bullshitting, but it still felt like he was being looked down on. He wanted to retort that he was an Uzumaki, a clan that had been renowned for their sealing skills, but the Sandame's warning about his heritage being a secret stopped him for a moment. Well, my name is Uzumaki, he reasoned. That's not much of a secret. Seriously, is the color of my hair really going to matter on that front? He was still irritated at the old man for dangling his parentage in front of him, although he was finding that he did trust the Hokage enough to wait on that front. Didn't mean he had to like it though. Yes, I can. He wasn't going to use his clan name, especially since there wasn't any guarantee it would work. Worst case scenario, it would just take longer to get started selling seals. Oh shit, Naruto thought as Kowski's eyes went contemplatively to his blonde hair. But I didn't say anything. What the hell is up with my hair, damn it? I'll hear you out despite my better judgment. I don't suppose you've been certified? Naruto shook his head. Not yet. Let me see 'em. Kowski held his hand out. Naruto pulled a stack of seals out of his jacket and handed them over. Huh, you actually made quite a few, and you went with one of the better designs, he said as he flipped through them quickly before picking one to examine in detail. Naruto shifted uneasily on his feet as his work was scrutinized. He'd come a long way with explosive tags since Kakashi's test, and he was fairly confident in the quality of his tags. Of course, the bar here was much higher than he'd anticipated. He was suddenly very thankful for how carefully he'd made the tags. It took him about 12 to 15 minutes to carefully write out an explosive tag, but he'd spent 30 minutes each on these just to be extra sure. Well, his clones had. There was no way he was going to sit around for hours making seal after seal. I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but it looks like these are at least worth testing, Kowski said, surprise evident in his voice. Tenten, he called out. Yeah, Dad. Her voice came from the behind the front counter, in another room. Mind the store for me, I need to check something out. What's going on? She asked, walking out of the back room. She was wiping her hands with a cloth, and there were what looked like oil stains on the apron she was wearing. Oh, Naruto-kun, she smiled as she saw him. You came. Hi Tenten-san, he waved. I said I would, after all. I need to go test some tags, so cover for me, Kowski said, holding up the tags. Tenten's eyes zeroed in on the seals with frightening intensity. Explosive tags? She asked, grinning excitedly. Can I help, please? Kowski sighed in resignation. You'd think I would have learned to keep my mouth shut by now, he muttered. Tenten practically skipped over to them, untying her apron and carelessly tossing it back to the counter. She snatched the tags from her father's hands without waiting for an answer, flipping through them with a look of unholy glee. Naruto was startled when Kowski formed a familiar cross-like seal with a look of concentration. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, the man said, and despite his intense expression only one clone popped into existence, heading towards the counter. Naruto thought that was a little odd, but he was more surprised by the technique. You know Kage Bunshin? Naruto asked before he could stop himself. Kowski raised an eyebrow at that. Tenten laughed. He's a Junin, she explained. If you can do it, why is it so surprising that he can? Wait, you can do Kage Bunshin? Kowski asked in astonishment, his eyes flicking to Naruto's hair again before turning to his daughter. And you knew about it? Tenten looked at her father in confusion. Is that a big deal? He lets me use them for target practice. Target practice? Kage Bunshin. That's. Kowski shook his head. Okay, let's head out to the back. He led them to a door in the back of the shop. Tenten, Kage Bunshin is a B rank technique. It's not something a genin can just pick up on a whim. B rank. Tenten looked at Naruto in surprise when they were outside. Where did you learn it then? Hey. Naruto chuckled nervously, scratching the back of his neck. It's, classified. He avoided her eyes, taking the opportunity to look around. There was a large training area behind the shop, filled with all sort of dummies, obstacles and other things he couldn't identify. So that's why the shop is out here, Naruto realized. He'd first tried looking for the steel dragon in the merchant district, eventually having to ask about it after looking at every shop twice. He'd been directed to the outskirts of the village, which had surprised him. It didn't seem like a great location for a business. Classified? Tenten asked, puzzled. What would? Tenten, Kowski cut in sharply. Classified is classified. Don't try to guess at it. Let's just see if this kid's tags are any good and leave it at that. Tenten perked up, looking at Naruto. Wait, you make explosive tags? Why didn't you say so before? You didn't ask. Naruto said, unnerved by how much attention his skills were getting all of the sudden. But, explosive tags. Tenten whined piteously. We're here, Kowski said dryly, saving Naruto from Tenten. They'd stopped at a smooth crater that was about 12 meters in diameter and 5 meters deep. Hey, she complained as her father snatched the tags out of her hands. This is an inspection, not a party, he said sternly, looking over one of the tags closely for about half a minute before handing it to her. Tenten was practically bouncing on her feet in anticipation while she was being forced to wait. She immediately produced a kunai from somewhere and tied the tag to it with obviously practiced easy mark. She called out, presumably to announce having armed it with chakra, and then threw it with her typical level of skill. It shot through the air unerringly to stick at the bottom of the crater, exploding in a very satisfying manner a few seconds later. Tenten giggled, a bright and open smile on her face that should not have been eerie, but was. Kowski was just looking at the explosion and aftermath with a critical eye. Tenten with stabby things was scary. Tenten with stabby things that exploded, that was terrifying. That was the routine for 10 tags. The tag would be carefully inspected, passed to Tenten, and then detonated safely. Well, that wasn't quite true. About halfway through, Tenten launched a tag angled up instead of down, followed immediately by a shuriken going faster that cut the tag off of its kunai, allowing it to flutter down. It exploded exactly at the level of their feet, smack dab in the center of the crater. Naruto was impressed at the showmanship, but the long-suffering look her father gave her probably meant that he wasn't. Well, I've seen enough, Kowski declared. Tenten pouted, but she couldn't wipe the smile off her face enough to make it very convincing. I have to say I'm very impressed, kid, Kowski said, but his tone kept Naruto from getting his hopes up too much. The quality of your tags is much better than I would have expected from someone with just a year in the field. Tenten looked at him, puzzled. A year? But I thought you graduated a couple of weeks ago. I did, 2.5 weeks ago, Naruto admitted. No, Kowski said, shocked. Kage Bunshin and this. Really? Naruto blushed a bit, unable to hold down a proud smile. Sheesh. Kids today, Kowski grumbled. That being said, I'd have to estimate those tags were about B grade in quality. Naruto's face fell a bit. Don't get me wrong, that's amazing. It's just the consistency of a couple of things is a bit too varied, like the delay and the power. With the philosophy of my store, I can only sell A grade. The difference may not seem like a lot, but it's a guarantee that you know exactly how the seal will perform. Honestly, I'd say with few months of refinement you could be making A-grade explosive tags if you keep at it, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to get certified. That'd get you access to a sealing chamber for one, which would definitely help things along. And it would allow you to charge a little more. Naruto perked up at the relatively short time Kowski thought it would take. A chibi Naruto was doing a victory dance in his head singing Kage Bunshin Naya. Wait, what? Naruto thought, weirded out by the unintentional Naya. Maybe I've been saying that a bit too much. I bet I can get to that level in a few days, Naruto declared seriously. Is that so? Kowski was smiling. Not condescendingly, but still in a way that seemed to say it's not going to be that easy, kid. I would have had it already if I hadn't gotten sidetracked working out the kinks in my flashbang tags, he grumbled. Suddenly, Tenten was up in his face, her eyes sparkling and giving him the very definition of puppy dog eyes. It was so intense he could almost imagine fluffy ears and a furiously wagging tail. What's a flashbang tag? She asked so excitedly and quickly the words almost ran together. Oh boy, Naruto thought in panic. I'm doomed. True to his word, Naruto had raised the quality of his explosive tags to Higurashi Kowski's elite standards in 4 days. The man's enthusiasm over Naruto's talent for sealing had been encouraging, and he'd urged the blonde to get his level 1 sealing certification. Naruto had basked in the praise, and even if he hadn't been convinced by that point the next incentive would have sealed it for him. Kowski had purchased a few of his flashbangs the day he had first showed them off, with a cryptic comment about having an idea that would help him. When Naruto had shown him that he could make A-grade high-yield explosive tags, Kowski had revealed what he'd done with the flashbangs. He'd shown them to the Anbu quartermaster, who liked them a lot, to the point where he wanted Naruto to provide them to Anbu. Technically, he didn't have to ask. A part of Naruto's employment contract as a ninja of Konoha was that the Shinobi Corps had first right of purchase to anything he wanted to sell to the general public, but Naruto had been over the moon about it. The fact that the village's black ops wanted something Naruto had invented was incredibly validating. Well, if playing around with explosive seals was considered inventing, that was. So Naruto had given the design details and notes to Anbu. The rules were that unless he died and didn't leave the rights to his descendants, Anbu had to buy the seals from him at a discounted rate, granted if possible. They were allowed to make their own if he wasn't supplying them with as many as they wanted, but they had to pay a licensing fee per tag. Naruto very much doubted they'd try to rip him off by making the seals under the table. It wasn't as though another Fuinjutsu user could just copy his designs and automatically have them work. Seals behaved differently for different people, so even with the detailed production notes he'd given them it would still take time, effort, and chakra for someone else to adapt his designs for their use. Especially since they couldn't spam Cage Bunshin like he did. His flashbang tags were not terribly complicated. They were just a creative variation of the explosive seal discovered and honed by the use of a ton of Cage Bunshin. The basic, fundamental seals found in books were painstakingly crafted to be as general as possible, to behave the most similarly for the most number of people. Chances were even if someone did invest the time and effort into adapting his seals, their product would be inferior unless they redid the entire development process, starting from the explosive tag. Naruto hadn't bothered to keep track, but he was sure that the time his clones had spent on that was in excess of several hundred hours. In the end, it would be cheaper to just buy them from Naruto. Between his reserves and his clones, his ability to produce seals far outstripped probably any other Fuinjutsu user in the village. The Shinobi Corps could only exercise their right to his designs if he was selling them commercially. If he created something he wanted to keep to himself, or to himself and Tenten if it exploded, as that girl was relentless down the line, that wouldn't be a problem. He was proud of his flashbang, but he planned to make much cooler stuff. The benefits of being associated with Anbu more than outweighed the minor irritation of having to share his designs on something minor. They bought a lot of them to build up their initial stock. Well, it seemed like a lot to Naruto, but he was just a single ninja. So Naruto's financial needs were looking to be well on their way to being met. He immediately started paying Inoichi for his help with the mental aspects of Cage Bunshin. The Yamanaka had actually been helping him even though he couldn't afford it then. They'd just filed a promissory note with the Hokage's tower, stating that Naruto would pay sometime in the future. The terms had been pretty lenient with regards to time, which put Inoichi Jiji firmly in the cool camp. Despite technically having years before he was required to pay anything, Naruto didn't want to delay it when he could pay. That would be plain disrespectful. Yeah, it would be disrespecting the trust the older blonde had placed in him. In addition to the immediate monetary benefits, it allowed him access to some low-level ceiling references that were classified for some reason or another. Like obfuscation guides, that detailed how to make seals even more difficult to understand or reverse engineer. Also, it gave him a slightly higher priority for scheduling time in the sealing chambers, and a slightly reduced cost for using them for personal projects. He hadn't fully appreciated the significance of the chamber use then, but it was quickly becoming apparent to him. He was currently in a low-level sealing chamber, taking the certification test. Basically, he had a set amount of time to complete a list of seals they had given to him. He was confident in his abilities, but the experience was shocking in a way he hadn't expected. I'm going to build myself a seal chamber, and call it the Room of Super Awesomeness. No, I want 3 chambers. One to use, and one to sleep in, and one to just have. Oh, and one for Uki-kun too. It was one thing to read about a sealing chamber, and another thing entirely to actually be in one. Even a low-level one such as they used for the beginner certification. The only word that came close to describing the feeling of being in it was clarity. Naruto had known in a theoretical sense what ambient chakra was, but to actually feel the lack of it was stunning. He was pretty new to the concept of sensing chakra, having only been doing it himself for the past month, but he'd never thought of it as being too similar to seeing or hearing. Thanks to the sealing chamber, he might have to rethink that. The chamber completely blocked sound from the outside in the same way it blocked chakra. It hadn't been something that Naruto had thought he would notice either, but the silence was loud. He hadn't realized how pervasive the background sounds of the world were until they were gone. The leaves in the wind, distant conversations, the sounds of insects, the faint rushing of water through pipes in the walls, the countless hundreds of sounds he tuned out in his daily life were deafening in their absence. Now the rasping of rubbing cloth every time he shifted slightly was discordant against the silence. Even the sounds of his breathing were suddenly obvious in a way that made him self-conscious. He even found himself regulating his breathing so it didn't annoy him. With the ambient chakra gone, it was like he'd taken a breath of fresh air for the first time after 100 years of having his face buried in a pillow. Chakra danced. Naruto had no words that could accurately describe his wonder at finally feeling his own chakra. Really feeling it. Every movement he made had the chakra in his body responding seemingly on its own. It even reacted to his thoughts. The subtle interplay of his own chakra with his movement, overshadowed and overpowered outside of the chamber, was beautiful. Something as simple as wiggling his fingers sent faint streams of chakra twisting through the air. He was sure that what he was witnessing in fascination would be smothered by the ambient chakra before even leaving his fingers in the outside world. The thought saddened him a bit. And it was due to this new sensitivity in his chakra that Naruto found himself sitting Caesar as he smoothly drew his brush across the paper in front of him, the seal singing to him as it came to life under his hands. All the introductory books on sealing that he'd read had mentioned that Caesar was the proper position for sealing, although they neglected to give any sort of reasonable explanation for why. After a day, Naruto had decided it was just a stuffy, pretentious tradition that had nothing to do with the real world, and had proceeded to sit comfortably. Normally that was cross-legged and slouching however he saw fit. Now that he could feel his chakra, he was astounded by how the position of his body affected how his chakra flowed into the seal. Caesar focused chakra forward into the brush, making it precise and smooth. Slouching or sitting sloppily had a small but noticeable negative effect on the quality of the chakra. Why couldn't they just explain that instead of saying it was the proper way to seal? The speed at which the brush danced across the scroll should have been far above his ability to accurately write it, but it felt like the seal knew how it was meant to be and he was simply the conduit through which it brought itself into existence. Naruto knew that the seal wasn't really writing itself and that it had to do with his newfound awareness of chakra, but it still felt like he wasn't interacting with it on some level. Naruto murmured happily as he finished explosive seal and started on a storage scroll. He knew without a doubt it was the best he'd ever drawn, and in under 4 minutes at that. What was that? The sound of his voice had resonated with the seal he'd just started drawing. Humming for a moment confirmed that something interesting was happening. Mentally accounting for the time, Naruto decided the speed at which he'd been going left more than enough time to experiment a bit. The room was filled with simple, tuneless humming as Naruto tested the effects of his voice on several basic sealing components. The seal as a whole would do a grand total of nothing, but it served as a great test. He was satisfied with his grasp on it after a few minutes, and switched to a new scroll to finish up his test. His humming took on a vaguely musical quality as he used it to further guide his chakra. Being able to feel his chakra had been beautiful, but feeling it dance to his voice was nothing short of ethereal. Stepping out of the antechamber of the sealing room was like walking out of a dream. The sudden rush of sound, smell, and chakra nearly overloaded Naruto's senses, almost sending him reeling back in disorientation. Lee-senpai, Guy-sensei, Neji-san. Naruto blinked as he caught sight of them. He'd told them that he wouldn't be showing up to training that morning, but he hadn't said why. I might have mentioned that I knew where you were, Tenten admitted from beside them. She'd known about the test, unsurprisingly given how often her father had been talking about it. Or possibly the fact that the better Naruto got at sealing, the bigger explosions he could provide. They insisted on showing up for moral support. Yash, your drive to learn new skills is so youthful. Lee was looking at Naruto with that fire in eyes that the blonde knew from experience meant that reality was about to look the other way for a minute. Guy-sensei, is it possible to learn Fuinjutsu without being able to externally manipulate chakra? My poor youthful Lee-kun, it is not. Guy clenched his hand to his heart, looking off into the distance forlornly for a moment. But with the power youth you shall find unexplored mountains of skill to conquer of your own. Osu. He grinned brightly at his student, giving his signature grin and thumbs up, a strange light glinting off his bared teeth with an audible ping. The strange sensitivity to chakra the sealing room had given him was fading as the myriad different sources bombarded him, causing his mind to automatically tune them out. But for one shocking instant there were a burst of something from Guy that cut through the static, singing of determination, hope, and steel sky ascend purple beyond the outside. And then it was gone, leaving Naruto to blink away the sudden lightheadedness. Try as he might to concentrate, the absolute, overwhelming clarity was lost to him. His sensitivity to chakra had returned to normal. Yash. I shall conquer that mountain with my hands and feet tied together, and if I can't do that I will run to the capital and back while blindfolded in half a day. What just happened? In that moment it was almost like he could have grasped that odd feeling, and then, something. And if you cannot do that, I shall take enough water to properly hydrate a village to Suna, one bucketful at a time from Lake Omagachi in Kumo. I want it back, Naruto thought to himself. As overwhelming as the sensitivity was, he couldn't let whatever had just happened fade into obscurity. His mind had been incapable of comprehending that feeling, unable to relate it to anything he could understand. Guy-sensei. Naruto knew with bone-deep certainty that it was not the nonsense his mind had cast it as. I need to understand what just happened. Lee. Naruto-kun. HN. Naruto turned his head at the sound of his name. His gaze had drifted off to the side as he'd tried to puzzle out what he'd witnessed. Guy and Lee were looking at him expectantly. Did something happen? They'd been saying something, but he'd been too preoccupied to pay attention. Purple Naya, he said decisively, as if that explained everything. What a confoundingly hip response. Lee was looking at Naruto with wide eyes like the other boy had just explained that squirrels were secretly in charge of the elemental nations, and that they were demanding a tribute of sushi every third Wednesday. Okay, that doesn't really make sense outside of my head, Naruto admitted to himself. Guy was looking at Naruto appraising Ly with a raised eyebrow. Truly, my eternal rival has been teaching you the secrets of his revolutionary coolness. Did you say something, Guy? Kakashi-kun. Guy twirled around to face the masked Junin, pointing a finger at him accusingly as though everybody else needed to be shown exactly where he was. Even your timing is hip. Is there no end to your coolness? Guy-sensei. Lee. Kakashi-sensei. Naruto greeted. Naruto, the Junin acknowledged, not raising his eyes from his orange book. Tenten-san. The girl rejected flatly, causing Lee to wilt momentarily. I'm not going along with that. Not now, not ever. Neji-san. The long-haired boy pointedly ignored his teammate, instead choosing to keep looking at Naruto with something odd and cold in his blank eyes. Why is everyone so hip today? Lee pouted. So you have come to support your student in his time of trial. But you see, I have arrived first, so this is my victory, Kakashi-kun. Guy crowed, crossing his arms and puffing up proudly. Oh, is Naruto doing something interesting here? I was just going to have a late brunch before meeting up with my team. I must have taken a wrong turn in the forest of death. Wonder how that happened. Naruto wasn't fooled, and felt a faint smile tugging at his lips. It was hard to get a grasp on who Kakashi was with how he vacillated between being a total jerk and then oddly helpful. When Kakashi had noticed him using a seal on Tora's ribbon, he'd mentioned to Naruto the possibility of tuning the chakra output so that it would be harder for other people to detect, and given him some pretty insightful hints on how to think about it. Since keeping other people from detecting his locator beacon on the cat wasn't relevant to the mission, the only reasonable conclusion, loath as Naruto had been to admit it, was that his sensei was actually helping him with his fuinjutsu. It was no coincidence that his sensei had shown up, despite his lame story. Guy flinched. Such cold disregard for your students' struggles, how can you be so revolutionary? Speaking of which, shouldn't you be with your teammates right now, Naruto-kun? I am, Naruto said. He knew Kakashi knew a clone was keeping Sakura and Sasuke company. And you're here. Yup. Okay. What mind-bending hypnosis is this? Guy asked in consternation. He shook his head as if to clear it. But it is most unyouthful of you to not congratulate your splendid student on taking his level 1 sealing certification. Oh, is that what happened? Congratulations. Here, have a. Kakashi rummaged in his vest for a second before pulling out a half-eaten ration bar. Maybe not. He put it back and reached into a different pocket to pull out a leather-bound book. Yeah, I don't need this. Handing it over to Naruto, he went back to reading his porn. The book was heavier in his hands than he had expected. Its cover was embossed with the kanji for nothing, faded by the years to near invisibility. Naruto known Kakashi long enough to know that this was either something really significant, or it was just some random book, probably porn he'd grown tired of reading too many times, that he'd had in his pocket. Maybe it was some weird lesson about expectations. Opening it revealed that it was handwritten rather than printed. The cover page proved to be incredibly interesting. Minato. Remember that sometimes being stubborn until the universe gives up in exasperation is best way to accomplish the impossible. For all other times, there's fuinjutsu. Your amazing sensei. The gallant Jiraiya, Kakashi. A more honorable student I could not have hoped for. Obito and Rin would be proud of you. Remember that living your life to its fullest is the only tribute they'd have ever wanted. And if you don't stop reading porn in public, you're never going to be able to settle down with a nice girl. At the very least, swap out the cover with something else. That's worked pretty well for me. The yellow flash of the sun over the water howling on the wind riding lightning, Namikaze Minato. P.S. I wish everybody would stop shortening my awesome title. Help me out with that, would you? Naruto. Let nothing stand in the way of your dreams. You will accomplish anything you put your mind to. You should think about wearing less orange. It'll clash with the hat. It'd be embarrassing to have a Hokage with such terrible fashion sense. Always look underneath the underneath. Also, brush your teeth, wash behind your ears, avoid black cats, and don't walk under ladders. The only free lunch is the one you steal. That should about cover it. Hitaki Kakashi. P.S. If you get lost on the road of life, keep taking lefts. Or is that for mazes? Naruto was frozen in shock. It felt like a stone was caught in his throat. Jiraiya of the Sannin had given this to the Yondaime Hokage, who had given it to Kakashi, who was now giving it to Naruto. What Kakashi-sensei had written, he believed in Naruto. In his ability to become Hokage. And then in his signature style he'd gone on to insult Naruto's fashion sense, and then give all sorts of random advice. Or was it really random? It was hard to say with Kakashi. Naruto didn't notice Neji's eyes narrow as he analyzed the blonde's expression, noting both Guy's and Kakashi's unusual demeanor. He was too busy flipping through the handwritten pages. It quickly became obvious that the book had far more pages than it physically should be able to hold. Fuinjutsu, Naruto realized excitedly. Between Jiraiya and the Yondaime, the book was probably teeming with incredible information about sealing. He was getting the inkling that his own sensei probably knew a whole lot more about the art than he was letting on. There were all sorts of notes on seals, ideas for techniques, and... Is that a shopping list? Seriously. Naruto snapped the book shut after flipping to the next page, blushing furiously as he came across a rather detailed drawing of a proportions. He glared at Kakashi for not giving him any sort of warning. The Junin just did his eye smiley thing and shrugged. Thanks, Naruto said simply. He didn't have the words to express his gratitude or confusion. So, Tenten said, awkwardly when no one said anything for about a minute. If we're congratulating Naruto-kun, does that mean he passed? Won't they need to examine the seals or something? Certainly, but I'm sure he's passed, Kakashi said. After all, he's my student. I seem to remember teaching myself sealing. Doesn't mean you're not my student. Whatever. This is nice. Naruto thought happily. The connection that Guy and Lee shared was something he'd envied ever since he met them, and it had seemed rather obvious that Kakashi wasn't going to be helping out on that front. But maybe there was hope yet. Naruto couldn't see them ever being like Guy and Lee, not that he wanted to be exactly like them, but perhaps Kakashi could be something of a mentor, and not just a teacher. Lee's gaze was bouncing between Naruto and Kakashi, his eyes shining in glee. So Naruto-kun learned his coolness from Guy-sensei's rival. I see. Naruto-kun, you are my eternal rival. He was halfway to assuming Guy's patented, nice guy, pose when he stopped in horror. Neji-san is already my eternal rival. But Naruto-kun, what do I do? He wailed. Neji had the look of someone who had just realized there was a golden opportunity floating right in front of them. It saddens me, but you must follow, the flames of your passion, the stoic boy said awkwardly, almost choking on the last half of the sentence. Naruto glared at Neji, who just shrugged as if to say, can you blame me? And Naruto really couldn't. Neji-san, you are so hip and filled with the flames of youth. Lee bellowed, overcome with emotion. But so is Naruto-kun. I cannot choose, I must have you both. Neji and Naruto each took several steps away from Lee in panic. This is your fault. Neji glared at Naruto. No, it's your fault. Naruto glared back. Lee, what passion? Guy-sensei. Lee-kun, shouldn't you take Naruto-kun's feelings into consideration? Tenten interrupted. If you take up all his time with challenges, he won't be able to make me explosive tags, and flashbang tags, and other explodey things. What? My feelings? Naruto thought in exasperation. Those sound a hell of lot like your concerns, not mine. Tenten's fascination with his sealing was quite endearing at times, but he would have preferred her sympathy not be quite so selfishly motivated. Why am I the only sane shinobi I know? Neji asked dryly as Guy and Lee tried to convince Tenten that the bonds of eternal rivalry were more important than explosions. Hey, I'm sane. Naruto objected. I've only argued with myself 3 times in the past week, and I won all 3 times. He frowned as he considered another angle. Although I guess I lost all 3 times as well. He brightened up. Oh, but there was that one time when I was both right, so my total is positive. Just go with the flow, Kakashi advised. Stress wrinkles will look really bad on you. Neji sighed heavily. Calm down, Naruto. You're going to make me seriously dizzy. Kakashi was amused, but Naruto's antics were definitely annoying Sasuke, Sakura, and Tazuna. But I'm so boo red, Naruto whined, flipping to his feet. He'd been hopping on one hand, backwards, rather than just walking like the rest of them. At first he'd been excited when Kakashi had announced that it was time for their first C-rank mission. While he'd been pushing his team to take more D ranks for the money, he had been getting rather annoyed with the tedious menial chores that the villagers had decided were tasks for ninja. He could almost imagine that it was another congratulatory present for his taking his sealing certification. And then he'd met the client. Naruto had met a few unpleasant drunks before, but the self-proclaimed super bridge builder truly took the prize for ornery, condescending, bastardly old jerk. He was disrespectful to them all, but he seemed to take particular pleasure in insulting Naruto's intelligence, height, clothes, and anything else he could come up with. Tazuna was going to need to hire another team of ninja to protect him from the first team if this kept up, seriously. Naruto's dream of protecting a beautiful, wonderful princess who was amazed with his awesome skills and could make the best ramen ever died a horrible, screaming death. Yeah, lay off the sugar brat. I'm gonna be super annoyed if you crash and have to take a nap. Don't kill the client. Don't kill the client. Don't kill the client, Naruto repeated in his head like a mantra. But a horrible accident that could in no way be our fault would be okay, right? Like a tree falling on him. We could totally blame that on a rabid squirrel. Naruto considered that for a moment, waiting for the proverbial angel on his other shoulder to chime in with a rebuttal. Yeah, I'd be cool with that, the angel decided. That's not how it's supposed to work, Naruto thought at himself crossly. All his pent-up energy was his thoughts' take on a life of their own. He'd grown rather used to spamming Kage Bunshin to clear his mind. It was so convenient. Any concern, random whim, or weird idea he had could be delegated to another him. But he hadn't been doing that since they started the mission. He was determined to approach his first serious mission like a professional, despite the obviously substandard client. That meant all his energy should be devoted to the mission. No training clones, no fun clones, no weights. Just a few clones to maintain a perimeter. In hindsight, that probably wasn't the best approach. Ever since he'd learned the Kage Bunshin, he'd been going full throttle and then some without any breaks. At first it had been really tiring, but he'd pushed through it and seemingly hit his stride. Suddenly stopping all that activity had made it clear that he couldn't just stop. He had too much energy and too many thoughts. Adapting to his new clone spamming lifestyle had changed him fundamentally. Trying to cram all of his energy into a few Narutos was making him distracted and twitchy. The lack of the goofing off clones had cut off the stream of social interaction that he'd become used to, forcing his mind to try and compensate by imagining other distinct hymns in his head to talk with. Stopping his normal clone activities completely wasn't the best way to go into mission mode. He'd have to think more on that later. The voices in my head don't like you, Naruto told the bridge builder darkly. Ooh, scary. Tazuna mock shivered. Figures you'd be off your rocker. I might actually have to worry if that was coming from Grumpy over here. He indicated Sasuke, who ignored him. Kakashi interceded, cutting off Naruto's animalistic growl. Ma, let's cool things down before someone loses an eye. Seriously. Now Naruto, what do you usually do when you're bored? He trained with Lee and Tenten, tended to his roof garden, and played various games with his clones. But playing tag didn't seem like something a professional ninja would be do on mission. Playing with myself isn't something I should do on a mission though, Naruto informed his teacher sagely. Tazuna sprayed sake out of his mouth and nose, coughing and wheezing. Kakashi chuckled, and Sakura squeaked in indignation, taking in a huffing breath in a way Naruto knew from experience that she intended to really shout at him. Before she could, Sasuke surprised them all by bursting out in unrestrained laughter. The dark-haired genin howled his amusement, hunching over and shaking with the force of it. He continued laughing hysterically until he ran out of breath, having to try and fill his lungs while still chuckling. Then he took one look at Naruto's confused pout and started all over again. "What?" Naruto demanded crossly. "Why are you laughing, Sasuke?" That only made him laugh even harder. "We can blame the rabid squirrel for 2 accidents. It's an evil rabid ninja squirrel that hates duck buttheads and mean old farts." Naruto was starting to think that his angel conscience or whatever was a bit defective. A distraction from Sasuke's confusing behavior arrived in the form of messages from the clones he had around them in the trees sending him frantic messages. Dangernon Yaka Kashik laws. The messages blurred together in their simultaneous arrival, but it was enough to get Naruto to spin around in panic in time to see a jagged chain wrap itself around his surprised sensei. Kakashi's exposed eye seemed to smile slightly as it met Naruto's horrified gaze, but it had to be a trick of the light. The ninja who had jumped over his sensei to wrap him up in chains yanked in tandem with his partner at the other end of the chain as soon as his feet touched the ground. "One down," a distorted voice proclaimed. The wet squelch as the chain tore through the Junin was almost drowned out by the sound of Sasuke's raucous laughter, which cut off suddenly as he noticed what was happening. "After all, he's my student. But I just..." Naruto couldn't even finish a thought, his mind going numb in shock. The enemy ninja didn't pause and they were on Naruto in an instant, passing by on both sides, their chain looping around him to prevent escape. Fast. The stillness of his mind had given way to sharp focus, a hyper-awareness honed by sparring with Lee and Tenten supplemented by thousands of hours of training. They were fast, yes, but wasteful. If they had anything close to Tenten's skill with weapons, the chain would have come in quicker and tighter and dissected him in an instant. Naruto felt the pull of a clone trying to use replacement on him, but he resisted it. Instead he leapt straight up, allowing the chain to close around thin air. He slipped his pack off his shoulder and hurled it at one who wasn't wearing a cloak. His leap peaked at about 10 meters, and in the moment where he hung still in the air he created a cage bunshin. They were both horizontal to the ground, but facing opposite directions with the real Naruto looking down. With a burst of chakra they used each other as springboards. Naruto shot after his pack, his clone flipping in the air to pepper the cloaked ninja with pointy bits of metal. The uncloaked ninja knocked Naruto's pack off to the side with the arm covered in a heavy metal gauntlet, revealing Naruto behind it. He managed to get his other arm up in defense, but Naruto grabbed onto it, swinging his legs to firmly plant his feet on the ninja's sternum. There was a burst memories as his clone was dispelled. "HYA!" Naruto yelled as he kicked out with chakra-reinforced legs, sending the masked ninja flying back. The chain snapped taut, yanking his partner in the same direction. Naruto was in the air again, the force of his kick having launched him into a flip. Fingers blurring through seals, Naruto drew a deep breath. The pressure built up painfully in his lungs but he ignored it. The last seals of the jutsu would normally be horse then tiger, for containment and then projection, but he wanted more than just blunt force. Dragon for compression. Bird C3 to boost rotation. Tiger with extended little fingers for a point-based projection. Fuden. Rinkuden. The drilling wind that buzzed through the air as it was launched from his lungs was hardly recognizable as being derived from the pressurized clump of air of the original technique. It screamed down at a slight angle to tear through the cloaked ninja after he passed under Naruto. That was the first indication that something wasn't quite right. Despite the increased penetrating power that the drilling motion added to the jutsu, it should have slammed his enemy into the ground before managing to dig into him. The corpse turned to water, revealing it to be a clone. Naruto. Sakura screamed in warning. Naruto let the Kawarimi swap him out when he felt a clone use the technique this time. Suddenly he found himself in a tree overlooking the fight. His clone was saved from being sliced up by Sasuke pinning the chain to a tree with a shuriken from where he'd jumped into the air, followed by a kunai to hold it in place. The enemy ninja disconnected from their chain, ignoring Sasuke and the clone still in the air to go for Tazuna and Sakura. Naruto was about to jump back into the fray when a hand fell onto his shoulder. He reflexively grabbed the arm and tried to throw, but was turned around and pinned to the tree like his efforts meant nothing. Kakashi-sensei. Naruto thought in shock. But how? A quick glance to where he had been dismembered revealed chopped up wood. Kawarimi, and Genjutsu, Naruto concluded. I shouldn't have missed that. His back from the dead sensei gave a reassuring eye smile, disappearing from before him without a trace. There was no blur, after image, or sound. He was in front of Naruto, and in an instant he was gone. There was a thud, and Kakashi was suddenly in front of Tazuna and Sakura, holding the limp forms of their enemies like unruly children. So cool, Naruto thought in amazement. He was pissed at Kakashi for scaring him, but the weirdo pervert probably had a reason. He created a few more Kage Bunshin to be careful, and swapped with the clone that Sasuke had saved, letting it dispel in mid-Kawarimi to get its memories of the fight. After an interesting accident, and a lot of trial and error, Naruto had discovered that Kage Bunshin could allow themselves to be dispelled in the middle of a Kawarimi, making the transition a tad smoother. And gaining their chakra back while doing the technique seemed to help him come out of it with lessened impact. Unfortunately, it only seemed to work if he was the one using it on them, and not the other way around. If a clone started the technique, it had to finish it fully. His experimental clones had shown that bad things happened to the Swaipy if the swapper bailed in the middle of the jutsu. Since it was the clones usually swapping him out of danger, that made it a lot less useful than he was hoping for. The ability to teleport out of danger without leaving a trace would be extremely cool, so he wasn't giving up on it. It wasn't just about the cool factor either. It did lessen the negative side effects of the jutsu. The less time he spent recovering from getting swapped out of danger, the better, even if it was only a 10th or a 20th of a second. Kakashi-sensei. Sakura cried out in relief. You're alive. Yo. Nice job, you three. Naruto and Sasuke, your teamwork was good. Sakura. Good job on protecting the client. That being said, you focus too much on your enemy Naruto. You should be more aware of your surroundings. Naruto's fists clenched in anger. Why was he the only one getting berated? Sasuke had also been lured away from Tazuna. Trying to protect you. Naruto tried to relax. Remember the book, he told himself. Kakashi didn't hate him, hopefully. And the truth was he had been too focused on what he had thought were the enemy. He should have noticed that Kakashi's body was just chopped up wood much sooner. Being singled out was embarrassing, but he should just view it as constructive criticism and not an insult. It was probably one of Kakashi's look underneath the underneath lessons. And if it wasn't, he'd take it as such anyways. Thanks, Sasuke, Naruto said grudgingly, his voice hoarse. For, he couldn't actually bring himself to say that Sasuke had tried to save him, and he ruthlessly squashed the urge to bring up the fact that he'd swapped himself out of danger with a clone already. Sasuke had thought he was in danger, and trivializing the fact that he'd acted would be rude. Sasuke was looking at him strangely. Is it that surprising that I thanked him? You've got a little. Sasuke swiped his thumb across the corner of his mouth. Huh. Naruto wiped his jacket sleeve across his mouth and nearly flinched when it came away bloody. Hey, I just bit the inside of my lip, he lied. Shit. His lungs ached a bit, but thankfully he didn't think there was any significant damage. He could already feel the pain fading as his enhanced healing got to work. That variation of the Rinkuden was something he'd practiced a lot with clones before trying out with his real body, as his early mistakes with it would have exploded his chest had he been doing it himself. Dropping the explicit containment so he could make the technique drill meant that he had to use shape manipulation to keep it from shredding him apart from the inside out. He actually could do it rather well, but being in a real fight had unanticipated complications. Stuff he really should have anticipated. Like the pressure of actually having his life on the line making things harder. He would have been able to safely stop the technique if he felt that it was going to seriously injure him. That was something he'd made sure of before chancing it with his real body. But the fact that it had been uncontrolled enough to hurt him at all was sobering. It was stupid of him to have used it at all. It would have been perfectly fine to put a bit more power into the regular version of the technique, but he'd complicated things unnecessarily because he'd been so angry at the ninja. It had felt like he had been in control of his emotions during the fight, but the way that it had left him drained when he realized Kakashi was still alive was telling. He now understood what cold anger was. Thinking back on the fight, Naruto couldn't help but be disappointed with how it had gone. It wasn't like he'd frozen up or anything, but he'd been so reactionary. Everything had just happened so quickly while he was off balance, there simply hadn't been any time for strategizing. Of course they'd attack at the most surprising moment. Stupid Sasuke, laughing like that. It's all his fault, Naruto thought to himself, although not seriously. It was cathartic to blame things on the Tem. Well, at least some things had gone well. Using clones to maneuver in midair was something he'd had to practice a hell of a lot, so he was pleased that it had been so instinctive in combat. Guy and Lee had helped him a lot with that. He'd known Guy Sensei long enough that the green-clad Junin's knowledge of physics and his ability to explain it wasn't that surprising. Although he never did figure out what made some angles youthful and others not. That seemed completely random. Having tied up the enemy ninja, Kakashi turned to their client. These two are Chunin-level ninja from Kurigakure. Actually, given by their reckless presence Hai no Kuni, I think they're more likely to be missing Nin. Either way, I doubt they are the only threat. Chunin level. Naruto wondered what that really even meant. In terms of combat, he hadn't really felt like they were much threat, although he had probably just been facing water clones the whole time. Still, in a straight-up fight he didn't feel like they'd be too much of a threat. But they didn't fight head-on, Naruto remembered. Just like Iruka-sensei said, ninja don't have to fight fair. The real them had ignored the clone Naruto and Sasuke to go after Sakura. No, they were after the client. Naruto felt chills go down his spine as he realized that whether or not he could have beaten them in a fight would have been irrelevant. He didn't know what he could have done to stop them in time if Kakashi hadn't shown up, and Sasuke had been in the air, unable to help either. Neither of them could attack, not with Sakura and Tazuna in the target zone. Chunin level isn't just about strength. He'd thought he'd known that there was more to being a ninja than just being strong, but he hadn't understood it. It was something he'd have to think more on. How did you read our movements? The cloaked missing Nin asked rather calmly, having regained consciousness. The rebreather distorted his voice oddly. On a sunny day like this, when it hasn't rained in 3 days. Hiding in a puddle like that was amateur hour. Seriously, Kakashi-sensei sounded like he was gently scolding children rather than insulting two grown men that had just tried to kill him. The cloaked ninja had a contemplative look in his eyes, but his companion was growling in frustration. Kakashi-sensei is giving the enemy looking underneath the underneath lessons. And one of them is actually listening. That decided it for Naruto. If even an enemy could take insults as a learning opportunity, then he should be able to do the same. Sensei is actually pretty awesome, Naruto realized. He'd barely even noticed the puddle except to step around it, but to see it and really comprehend that it was out of place, and what that meant, I've got a long way to go. Then why did you let these brats fight if you knew that? Tazuna asked. Kakashi shrugged nonchalantly. I could have killed them instantly, but I wanted to see who their target was. Us. His gaze focused in on Tazuna sharply. You? Ha ha ha, what do you mean? Tazuna's laughter was forced, and he was obviously nervous. Naruto was pleased that he'd managed to make that connection on his own. You hired us to protect you from bandits and thieves until you completed the bridge, not shinobi. If you had told us there were ninja after you, the mission would have been classified as a more expensive B rank, and you'd have gotten a more experienced team to reflect the higher risks. Whatever your reasons for lying to us may be, this mission is now outside the scope of our duties. Naruto's first instinct was to be smug that the crotchety old man hadn't managed to pull one over them, but the look on his face stopped him cold. It was like the life had drained out of his eyes. Tazuna looked so old, tired, and defeated that it would be beyond cruel to rub it in. The bridge builder hadn't just been trying to cheat them because he was cheap. There was definitely something else going on. Whatever his reasons were, they were deadly serious. You're right, Tazuna admitted. This is definitely more than I paid for. There's a super dangerous man after me. He told Team 7 about Gato, the ruthless businessman who had taken control of Wave by force, executing anyone who stood up to him. The wealthy shipping magnate had ground the economy under his heel, so there was no way that even the daimyo of Wave even had the money to hire ninja to help them out. And then the man had shown his devious side by bringing up his grandson and daughter. Any thoughts? Kakashi asked, surprising the genin. Was their sensei actually looking for their input, or was this some kind of test? Sakura looked scared to Naruto, and Sasuke's expression was inscrutable. Either way, the answer should be the same. They shouldn't continue the mission. It was dangerous, they weren't the right team for it, and it was pointless. If Gato was really as bad as Tazuna was saying, and Naruto didn't actually doubt it, then what was to stop him from simply having the bridge destroyed after it was finished? What had stopped him from destroying even before now? No one was guarding it according to Tazuna, but Gato had been content to let it be. Naruto didn't want to ask these questions aloud, at least not in front of Tazuna. On the one hand, it seemed kinder in the long run to at least inform him of the grim possibilities, but he was afraid that it might just break the old man. If I were an evil bastard, why wouldn't I just blow up the bridge as soon as they started building it? Why let Wave even think it had a chance if he's gone through the trouble of crushing their spirits in every other way? Could he want the bridge for himself? He'd crushed their economy, so he was making money just by using the country to help him ship or smuggle other goods. Perhaps having a bridge would also help with that. But then why wouldn't he wait until it was finished? Maybe if he killed Tazuna and completed it himself he could claim ownership of it in some way, although the idea felt iffy to Naruto. Gato could probably take control of the bridge like he had the rest of the country, and he sounded like the kind of person who would let Tazuna build it first so he didn't have to pay for it at all. So why would he leave it half-finished, like some macabre monument? Naruto frowned as he came to a chilling realization. Maybe that was the point, so that it could be a monument to the withering hope of Wave. If Gato left it there, it would be like an invitation to try and build further, and if he kept killing whoever tried, he could keep whittling down on the spirit of Wave until they completely gave up. And if they ever managed to finish it, well, he could take it for himself or blow it up. There was no way to win. So should Team 7, in their capacity as shinobi, take a mission they weren't fit or paid for. No, Naruto couldn't accept that answer though. You guys can do whatever, Naruto said, not giving away his grim ponderings. I'm going to continue the mission. If whatever objective they could hope to achieve was dangerously beyond them, Kakashi would simply overrule his desires and send them home. Naruto didn't know what he would do if that was what his sensei decided, but as far as he was concerned, he had to continue the mission. At least to the point where he could see if the old man was telling the truth. If you're going, you'll need me to keep you from drowning yourself in a puddle, Sasuke said. Besides, there's no way I'm letting my records say I abandoned my first real mission. Naruto growled a bit at Sasuke's assertion, but he figured the sourpuss just needed an excuse not to look like he had actual feelings. Sakura looked conflicted. She obviously thought that this was too much, but she didn't want to disagree with Sasuke either. Naruto felt a bit bad for her, but being a shinobi was a dangerous occupation. Shying away from even the possibility of danger wasn't something they could afford to do. Would Gigi approve? Naruto wondered. Shinobi were fundamentally mercenaries after all. The tactical books he'd been reading were clear on what he should at this point. Shimura Danzo would definitely say to drop the mission. There was tons of risk and virtually no possibility of real success or reward. But Naruto couldn't help but hope that the Sandaime would approve of them continuing the mission. The way he talked about the will of fire and what it meant should apply even if this was about the suffering of people in other countries. He knew that it was possible that the Hokage didn't mean it that way, although the thought of that possibility made him feel sick. What he did know, however, was what the will of fire meant to him. So should they continue the mission as proud shinobi of Konoha? Yes. If you don't like the answer, I guess you just have to change the question. Well, that's that then, Kakashi said, oddly cheerfully when it became clear that Sakura wasn't going to speak up. We'll protect you at least until you get back to your country. Maybe Kakashi-sensei is thinking like I am, Naruto thought in relief. If he'd forced them to abandon the mission, Naruto's pride in being a Konoha shinobi would probably have been shattered. If the will of fire didn't separate them from the missing nin tied to the tree, then what was it good for? Tazuna had collapsed to his knees in relief and was muttering thanks so sincerely that Naruto was ashamed that the thought of leaving him to his own devices had even crossed his mind, however briefly. So, Dobi, Sasuke said, grabbing Naruto's attention. Do you still feel the need to play with yourself, or did these two relieve your tension? He indicated the enemy ninja, who were looking at him in disgusted shock. Tazuna and Sakura were also looking at the Uchiha with oddly scandalized expressions, while Kakashi was just looking amused. Naruto didn't know what the big deal was. Despite the super weird way Sasuke was asking, it was a legitimate question. Being filled with energy to the point of bursting was distracting, and playing some fun games would definitely be good for his mindset. Especially to help uplift his mood after his dark thoughts on what was happening to Tazuna's country. I've thought about, and I decided it would be a good idea after all, Naruto said. How can I act professionally if I'm all pent up? What's wrong with him? Naruto wondered. Sasuke had a ridiculous expression of flabbergasted shock on his face. Naruto would go so far as to say his flabber had probably never been more gasted. Sakura's face was turning an excessive shade of red. How can you say that with a straight face? Tazuna asked in amazement. Wise words, Naruto-kun, Kakashi praised him, his eye twinkling madly. See, Kakashi-sensei gets it, Naruto said proudly. In fact, I think you should probably do it too, Sasuke. You're always so grumpy. Having some fun would be really good for you. Sakura made an odd squeaking sound, and Sasuke's face had tightened in anger. Nah, it was probably embarrassment. Sasuke had never joined the other kids in playing games, so he probably didn't have the faintest idea where to start. I guess you probably don't know how, Naruto continued sympathetically. Maybe you can get someone to help you out. Not me, of course. It'd have to be someone who doesn't mind that you've got no experience. And that you. He might not hate Sasuke, but he'd bet that playing tag or hide and seek with Mr. Broody would suck all the fun out of it. Maybe Kiba, the Inuzuka, would relish the chance to lord over the Uchiha's awkward first attempts at playing games. Herngle. Sakura made a strangled sound, flushing almost as red as that weird girl who sat in the back at the academy always did. The idea of Sasuke hanging out with Kiba isn't that weird, is it? Naruto. Sasuke growled, a seriously whacked out crazy look in his eyes. I'm going to kill you. Holy crap, he's serious. Naruto dodged a wild stab of Sasuke's kunai, leaping out of range. Yikes, what's the whoa big deal? Naruto was confused. Did Sasuke hate even the idea of having fun? Okay, maybe Kiba is a big step. Akamaru Kanora. Show you the ropes first. If anything, Sasuke's attempts at disemboweling him seemed to get even more murderous. Maybe Sasuke is just a lost cause. Who could hate the idea of playing fetch with a puppy this much? Tazuna watched one of his would-be protectors tried his very best to brutally murder another. I take it back, he said despondently. I'm super dead.